How shall I open this? I'm not as natural a streamer, everybody, as I am a sort of pre-recorded podcaster. But we are live, and we're joined by an old colleague of the channel, Sal, who is. What is the title of your name? So how do I always mix up the what's going on with shipping? Right, that's right.
That's it. What's going on with shipping?
Yeah, what's going on with shipping? And we last had you on the show, I think like 2.5 years ago, when I had around, I don't think I even had 10,000 subscribers. And for some reason you're like, yeah, sure, I'll come on your show. You're very kind. And now, well, you've ballooned and I've grown, but yeah, kudos to your work that you've done in that time. And the coverage of the Strait of Hormuz and everything that, frankly, has been going on, I think, in the Middle East is just insane. Obviously, I want to get into a little bit about the sort of the broader trajectory of things in the past 3.5 months. Wow, it's weird saying that. Is it 3.5 months? Yeah, more or less. 100 days plus. But right now, we've obviously had this Apache helicopter incident, and Trump is now threatening some kind of response, or what was the word? Necessity to respond. And this is all still within the vicinity of the Strait of Hormuz. So whilst you might not be an Apache helicopter expert, although maybe you are, I was kind of curious about your thoughts of these latest developments today and how it plays into everything you're covering and focusing on in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah. So, well, first, thanks for having me back. So this is a really interesting story because it covers multifaceted elements of what's going on. So we had strikes earlier this week against targets along the coast of Iran by the United States, which makes the talk of a ceasefire very kind of strange because they are exchanging fire. What has been going on is Iran has obviously mined the strait. We've gotten confirmation of that from multiple sources now, and we had an Omani image of a mine that was come up. And what has happened is Iran is kind of forcing ships to transit through the northern half of the strait in Iranian waters. The U.S. in return has been escorting very clandestinely, although the stories have come out about this. They've been clandestinely doing escorting ships out of the Strait of Hormuz through the very southern part of the strait along the coast of Oman. And one of the things that they've been doing is twofold. One, they've put these unmanned craft into the Strait of Hormuz. Now, they've got unmanned surface vessels and they have underwater vessels, which are being used to hunt mines in the area. And then the second part is they've put aircraft over the Strait of Hormuz, both fixed wing and rotor. And in the case of the rotor wing, the helicopters, these are AH-64 Apache helicopters from the 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, part of the 18th Airborne Corps. They're providing kind of the oversight. And what they are there to do is really counter the unmanned surface and aerial vessels and vehicles that are coming at ships. We've seen several ships hit over the past couple of weeks. And in this case, what we have is we don't know what has caused the Apache helicopter to go down, besides the fact that it was shot down. The two pilots, and a helicopter going down in the water is one of the worst things. You can't really eject from a helicopter because of the rotors. You have to crash into the water. You have to egress out of the helicopter. You're treading water in the area. You got life jackets on, and then they get rescued by a 24-foot what's called a Corsair. It is built by Saronic Industries. It's an unmanned surface vessel that is out there basically providing intelligence. And so they vectored this Corsair out. The two pilots obviously climbed aboard. There's no crew on board, climbed aboard on it, and the Corsair took them out to meet with Navy ships to rescue them. So I think it's the first time ever, at least in the U.S., that we've had a remote controlled drone save pilots who have crashed in the water.
Yeah, there was a very interesting conversation I had with Lloyd Austin, actually, in an upcoming conversation. And one of the things he was talking about is just how much drones have reshaped warfare, which is kind of obvious, but sort of in a search and rescue, search and recovery, even in certain contexts like this. But what I also think is noteworthy about this incident is that this is, I think, the first Apache that's been downed, at least in this war, but for quite a while. And it seems a little bit unclear what exactly happened. Some people are saying that this is a false flag by the United States to give them a reason to go back at war with Iran for some reason. It is. Others are just like, it's just Iran. But sort of that doesn't make sense because the Iranians just established an effective truce or cessation of hostilities with the Israelis. So why would they want to then escalate with the United States by doing this? But maybe they think that they don't have a choice. So I'm just kind of curious how, with all of that in mind, this also plays into the Strait of Hormuz, because the Iranians really seem to have the comparative advantage over that. Wouldn't you agree?
They do. I mean, we had Secretary Wright come out from the United States and talk about the fact that there's, a meaningful increase in the number of ships coming through the strait, which I think is absolute BS. I don't think there's any meaningful increase at all. We're barely seeing, single-digit ships coming in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. We're seeing maybe some more ships come out, but we're not seeing any go in. And that is significant. And I think one of the things that we've seen is these dueling blockades. You have the Iranians establishing their Iranian, what was basically called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the PGSA, and then you have the U.S. executing their blockade, trying to keep any ships from going in and out of Iranian ports. And so you've kind of gotten this deadlock in many ways where we're not seeing a lot of movement out. We've seen some peaks and troughs, but I think the most movement we've seen in any single day come out of the strait is maybe about 20 ships, when we were historically looking at 130 to 140 ships a day coming out. Still at least 160 deep draft big tankers stuck in the Persian Gulf. Maybe a quarter have gotten out all told, so about 30 or 40 have gotten out. So we're not seeing a lot of movement at all. And this is just playing havoc with the global economy, as we know, because of disruptions, not just in oil, but in other commodities, ammonia, sulfur, helium, and fertilizer in particular.
Yeah, and this sort of leads me to an underlying framing that I've had for a while now, Sal, which is simply that I think one of the biggest things that this war has done is give Iran and the IRGC a huge amount of strategic clarity, simply in the sense of, for a long time, a large proportion of the Islamic Republic would have felt that getting a bomb, a physical nuclear weapon, would have been the biggest deterrent against continued interference from the Israelis, Americans, whoever. But right now, what the Trump administration seems to have done is given them clarity over that actually their biggest asset is geography, is the Strait of Hormuz, in a bigger way than a nuclear warhead could ever be. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's a little bit too simplistic assessment?
I think the bomb is on a different level in some ways because of what it represents, especially toward Israel and the threat it has. But I do think that the Strait of Hormuz was always a weapon that Iran had in its kind of, sheath that it could unleash. This was known for a long time. I worked for the military for many years. And the concern of closing the Strait of Hormuz was there. It had never been done. It never happened. And I think that the Trump administration failed on several levels. Number one, they failed to look at what the Houthis were doing in the Red Sea from the end of 2023 to 2025 and how effective the Houthis were in diverting traffic. At least 7 to 10% of global trade had to route around Africa because of the threat posed by the Houthis. Now, you had an alternative. You had an alternative route where you can go around Africa. But using many of the same weapons, unmanned surface and aerial drones, guided missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, they were able to interdict trade quite effectively. The Iranians were going to be able to do that much more because of their depth of weaponry, and more importantly, because of the strategic nature of the fact that you can't really bypass the Strait of Hormuz. It's a cul-de-sac. You've got to go in there and get it. Yeah, there's some pipelines that get some oil out, but nowhere near the full capacity out. So I think the Trump administration failed to take that lesson. They also took the incorrect lesson from July of last year when they launched strikes along with the Israelis against Iran, and they didn't see a meaningful closure of the Strait of Hormuz then. I don't think they really banked on it. And I have to say, watching this unfold, if you look very early in the conflict, the U.S. was allowing Iranian ships to sail unmolested in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. They actually unsanctioned Iranian oil for a brief period of time. They didn't have the correct assets in place, the amphibious ready group. And so they really had to play catch up on this. And you're right. I think what this has done is given Iran a weapon that they can now use. They are negotiating with countries and companies to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. This is something they did not have prior to February 28th.
No, it's proven, I think, that controlling a choke point is more powerful than an outright military victory in this case. But to what extent have the Americans dealt significant damage to the Iranian Navy? We've talked about little boats with chain guns on them or equivalent, but like, what is the actual state of the Iranian Navy, and is it in a pretty decent shape, or we just don't know?
Well, the U.S. has done an effective campaign in destroying the Iranian Navy. I think in satellite imagery and images we've seen that the vast majority of what was the Iranian Navy has been destroyed, which means that there's no, fighting force that can go toe to toe with the U.S. Navy. But again, what we learned from the Red Sea and what we've seen even in the Black Sea, and even go back to Somali piracy, is you don't need many weapons to intimidate an unarmed commercial merchant ship. You just need to provide risk. And I think this is the other failure that the U.S. did not have, is they failed to appreciate that commercial shipping is going to be risk adverse. And even with insurance and all the money associated with it, if there is a threat to their vessel, they're going to hold their vessel in place, because what insurance pays you on a ship is the loss of the ship, loss of the crew, loss of the cargo. What it doesn't pay you is the loss of the next 10, 15, 20 years of the life of that ship. And I think what happened was, you only need a fast boat with a machine gun or an RPG or a drone to intimidate commercial shipping. And we've seen that. We've seen the Iranians on March 1st attack shipping on the first day of the war, go out there and just recently use missile attacks against two vessels, a South Korean vessel and a French container ship. And so the Iranians have that ability. And while the U.S. has been able to stage destroyers through the Strait of Hormuz, what they haven't done is provide meaningful full escorts for ships coming in and out, except for two U.S. flagships they got out.
Okay, interesting. And what does this tell us then about Iran's state of hard power versus soft power? And what I mean by that is that they've used the Navy, but they've also been, from reports, I think the FT and Wall Street Journal and so on, that they've been negotiating or talking to the Gulf states. They've been talking to Oman about sharing this. I'm obviously going to get into the idea of a toll booth or the permanent change to this region in a second, but like, in your experience of following this, are we seeing them use more soft power to try and incentivize countries to play ball, or it's more like, we will force you to pay?
Well, I mean, the idea of setting up the toll booth was an interesting one, because it could generate revenue for Iran. And what we've seen is the U.S. has countered that. They have sanctioned, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. So if you do business with them, Iran has countered with that, with doing methods of payment via cryptocurrency. We actually had a very strange case where an Indian ship thought they paid their toll, but they actually got kind of scammed and paid the cryptocurrency to someone incorrectly. And so they lost $2 million in doing this. We've seen Oman come out and maybe the potential for a Gulf cooperation strait. The problem you have is obviously, number one, under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is the agreed statement of how international law will be arbitrated on the world's oceans. They can't do this. They can't prohibit what's called transit passage. Iran by itself cannot prohibit the safe movement of ships in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. There are examples where you have tolls, the Panama Canal, Suez Canal, but those are, artificial creations, and there's pilotage, there's tugs. And even where there's other areas like the Danish Straits and the Turkish Straits, in the case of the Danish Straits, they control both sides of the strait. Same thing with the Turkish Straits. And they do provide services. And, we've had, the CEO of Chevron come out and say they're not going to pay tolls. Countries have come out and said they're not. Macron came out for France and said that. And so this could be a fight. Yet at the same time, we're seeing India and Pakistan and a few countries working with Iran to get fuel out, because they need it, liquefied petroleum gas, and particularly for cooking and heating. They need to get that out. And so Iran has put itself in a very good position because of the conflict to be a negotiator. I think they find themselves in that seat very, very comfortably now. And it's definitely something that it's going to be hard for the U.S. to do, because there really isn't a military solution to this. The U.S. cannot militarily force open the strait and keep it open with military force without a massive commitment.
But explain one thing to me, which is sort of there's been conflicting reports, and maybe you've got a clearer sense of it, and it's actually very simple. But this whole idea that the Iranians at one point weren't letting anybody through, and then they were letting Chinese ships through, and they were letting certain Russians. What is the reality on the ground? Is it like a handful of ships a day? Is it literally nothing sometimes? Depends how the IRGC is feeling.
We're seeing anywhere from just a few ships to maybe a dozen tops going through, and Iran is controlling that northern strait area. They're routing them through their waters, and we're seeing the ships kind of clearing through their toll booth that they're operating in the area. And the issue that we were seeing initially was some concern that we saw ships being loaded, for example, at Karg Island, which is located up the Persian Gulf, going out into the Gulf of Oman and potentially doing ship-to-ship transfers, trying to mask the oil, put it on another ship so it can run the blockade. The U.S. has countered this with being very strong on their blockade. They've actually been seizing vessels, including an Iranian ship recently, an Iranian tanker, and they've been targeting ships, particularly what are ships of the dark fleet. These are ships operating with false registries, no insurance, and what we've seen is the U.S. have been using F-18 Hornets with Hellfire missiles to hit these ships. Matter of fact, we had a very overt one just the other day off the coast of Oman, where the ship was Indian crew, and the Indian crew had to be taken off the vessel with several crew members injured. We're not exactly sure how that's going to fall out between the U.S. and India in relations for this attack.
Right. No, it really is a case of multinational caught up in it, but only two sort of entities really fighting it. And then, of course, this leads me to the significant figure, although it's a little bit old now, so it's going to be higher than that. But I think it was the US State Department or Department of War had said that almost $5 billion worth of revenue have been lost for Iran because of the US naval blockade. How accurate is that figure? And do we have any idea of just how bigger impact the blockade is having on the internal economic conditions of the Iranians?
Well, I mean, if you just do math on, a 2 million, barrel tanker and if oil's going for, almost $100, a barrel, then, I mean, you come up very quick with almost $20 million, $200 million of fuel right there that's sitting out there. And so it becomes now Iran's not selling oil for $100 a barrel at all, much lower than that, but it's definitely costing them. And what we're seeing is the Iranian tanker fleet is really hove to. They're at anchor either in the Persian Gulf or just outside the Persian Gulf. They're in territorial waters in countries like Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka. They're not coming out for fear of being seized by the United States or being attacked. And so this is definitely having an economic impact. Now, Iran has gotten some backdoor ways to move fuel in. They're moving some via the Caspian Sea, which is their northern coast, but there is not large ships on the Caspian Sea, so you can't move, anywhere near the quantity of cargo that way. They're doing some cross-border, but again, trucks coming across the Pakistan border cannot replace a 2 million barrel tanker coming in on a daily basis, and this is what is hurting Iran now more than anyone else. And it's caused disruptions across the entire global stage, because where we were getting 20 million barrels of oil out of the Persian Gulf every day, now we're getting somewhere in the range of 5.5 to 6 million barrels through pipelines coming across the UAE or Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, now it makes me curious, because one of the things that quickly came to mind for me, the background in economics, is that it's not just about Iran's military action, it's about the less sexy stuff of insurance, for example. I've had a couple of other guests on who have been quite keen to put this point forward, like Anas Ajahid, I think that's his surname, but he's put a big emphasis on insurance. So what's actually causing more disruption here? Is it the military action between the sides, or the insurance companies refusing to cover vessels?
Well, I think at the very initial part, it was insurance, and insurance is really crucial. That's what we saw happen in the Red Sea when you saw the Houthi attack. Remember, Houthi in over 2 years, they only attacked about 125 ships, maybe struck 24 and sunk 4 vessels, killed, I think it was somewhere in the range of 9 merchant mariners. So in terms of effectiveness, when you consider 22,000 vessels annually go through the Red Sea, it's a pretty small percentage. But what the attacks did was trigger a uptick in war risk, so much so that you went from, almost no money to pay to go through that region in the Red Sea to about 1%. Now, 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have a $1 billion container ship with 20,000 boxes on board, 1% is $10 million. And you're not going to pay that when you have an option to go around Africa. And that's just $1 million. Plus, you're not paying the Egyptians a Suez Canal toll. The initial part in the war in the Persian Gulf was the insurance companies when Iran struck on March 1st.
Yeah.
The insurance companies basically announced a 72-hour cancellation, that they had the right within 72 hours to cancel all war risk insurance. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is the insurance companies, the insurance groups are the shipping companies. They pool their resources together. So none of them wanted to pay out anything. So they basically held the ships in place. They renegotiated new war risk, which is a higher premium, which they did, which you can get now. There's no problem getting war risk. The problem is the other element is that security. Where's the security for the ships? They don't just want the insurance, they want the security. And the problem is the security hasn't manifested itself. The U.S. isn't in the Persian Gulf to an extent to provide coverage, and nobody quite trusts the Iranians, much like they didn't trust the Houthi. And, even up until the start of this conflict, shipping hadn't really returned to the Red Sea, at the beginning of this conflict. It was just starting to come back, and that went back to 2023. And so insurance plays a big role. When the U.S. announced it was going to provide war risk insurance, that was too late. I mean, that was commercial war risk was already out there. They by the time the U.S. did that in week 8, that was too late. And the problem you have now is shipping companies can get the insurance. It's going to be a premium. You're going to pay a lot. You're going to pay from 1% to 5% to go through the Strait of Hormuz. But none of them are going to move without security. That's the other element is they don't want to take the chance. And it goes hand in hand, I would argue. The insurance and security have to be there together.
So in the time that we've been talking, the president just got off a phone call with the Wall Street Journal, and he said that, quote, the blockade was making Iran very poor, and he would keep it in place as long as necessary. He sought to play down the helicopter incident, saying that it, quote, wasn't a big deal. Wow, I'm contradicting my own opening. And stressing that the, quote, the pilot is fine. As you said, the Apache crew spent 2 hours in the water as darkness fell, according to Captain Tim Hawkins, spokesman for Central Command, CENTCOM. And one senior U.S. official described the crew's escape from the downed aircraft as, quote, a hand of God moment. Any reactions to that?
I can never read President Trump. I don't think anybody can. I joke, I do a weekly recap and on Sundays, and it's like, I recap the week and it starts off one way and it ends the same. It's kind of like Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over again. I've used Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, rabbit season, duck season. It seems not to change. And again, it's the mood here. I'm not sure what the solution is. The U.S., initially came in and said, listen, the Strait isn't a priority. It's not our priority. It's everybody else's priority. That has changed. Had the hearing the other week with Secretary Rubio, where the question was, how do you reopen the Strait of Hormuz? And basically, it's what leverage do you use? I would argue that the one lever the U.S. has to use in the opening of the Strait of Hormuz is getting Israel to back off. I think that is the one lever they do have, is that the U.S. has some control over Israel in some measure, in some way, to either through political or economic leverage to get them. Because I think one of the things that Iran has to fear is that the Israelis see this as their moment to ensure security for themselves in a generation, to ensure the protection in Lebanon and to ensure that there's not a nuclear armed Iran. And I think that one of the things the shoot down does is raise the element again, is whether this actually is a ceasefire, because there is armed conflict going on. I mean, they're shooting at each other in the Strait of Hormuz. And what it represents is if an AH-64 Apache helicopter can be shot down, if I'm on a liquefied natural gas carrier, let's just call that a big floating bomb, I really don't want to sail it through the Persian Gulf into the Strait of Hormuz and take a chance to get hit by a unmanned drone or cruise missile.
Goodness. I mean, I can't speak to shipping like you can, but I can certainly speak to the diplomatic side. And Yeah, the what we've seen from horizontal to vertical escalation, and back again, it's just all over the place. But Sal, simply then, has the economics of shipping and maritime security changed because of this situation?
I think what we have seen probably from the last time we've talked is a gradual, threat to the freedom of the seas. I mean, this has been a very, I started my channel back in 2021 when Ever Given got stuck in the Suez. But if you look at the events that have transpired just in those, 5 years, we've seen the Black Sea, we've seen the Red Sea, we've seen issues up in the Baltic. We've seen the U.S. with operations in the Caribbean against drug running boats. I would argue, one of the things that fundamentally brought global economy up to, standard of living across the planet was the idea that the oceans were open for trade and you can move ships. I could flag my ship in Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands because it was cheap. They don't need navies because, you don't need a navy to protect a ship on the open ocean. Every now and then there'll be pirates, there'll be these occasional threats, but that's beginning to change. And what we're seeing now is geopolitical threats emerging. You're seeing the Russians and the Ukrainians targeting commercial shipping in the Black Sea much more than ever before. We saw it with the Houthis in 2023 into 2025. And now we see it with the situation in the Persian Gulf, although that we saw multiple attacks much earlier with that back in 2019. And we're still moving a lot of goods around the planet. I would argue 80 to 85% of all goods are moving without a problem around the planet. But the problem are these key little choke points right here. If the Houthi reappear, if all of a sudden they start targeting ships, which they announced that they're going to start targeting Israeli-owned and linked ships, that's how it started back in 2023 and morphed into attacking more ships. Well, that's going to create a huge disruption. And I think that the idea of moving trade around the planet is still going to happen. We move over 12 billion tons every year. But what we're seeing is a reallocation of that. We're seeing new supply lines being drawn. The U.S. is benefiting from this because they're offloading oil in large numbers. The Panama Canal is at record numbers right now because we're shifting transits through there. The Russians just ran the earliest ever liquefied natural gas carrier through the Arctic to get to Asia because they don't want to run LNG carriers through the central Mediterranean because they had a ship, the Arctic Metagas, attacked and blown up, and it's drifting there off the coast of Libya or Malta right now. And they don't want to sail them all the way around Africa. So we're seeing this kind of realignment of shipping in a way that literally, I mean, you have to go back to 1968 and the closing of the Suez Canal as a result of the 6-Day War. It's the most significant we've seen in that time. And we're moving 3 times as much cargo as we were back in 1968.
Yeah, I just got back from a trip from Malawi in southern East Africa, and there was such a large of new containers and shipping that I could see when we were just traveling around parts of the country that were coming in from Mozambique. And this was an implication because of just the shifts that you've just described, but also because of just the having to go around Africa and the whole thing just being disrupted. It's fascinating to see how it happens in areas that are perhaps less covered or aware. But a couple of specifics I'm interested on this angle, because obviously at the same time that the war in Iran has been happening or already became something, the Europeans have begun stepping up pressure on Russia's shadow fleet in and around parts of the Baltic Sea and the Med. Russia's obviously interfering with British naval waters as well, maritime waters. But then on the other side, you've got China and how this is implicating for China's just calculus and the way that they leverage sort of, shall we say, unconventional means of a navy, like fishing boats and such. I'm just kind of curious what you think about those two angles, or any others that you think stand out.
Well, I mean, the European, I mean, we just had the French seize another tanker out in the Atlantic, and this is one of those dark fleet vessels. And this is that proliferation of ships that are operating without proper registry. They fly a Botswana flag, but Botswana doesn't really register them. They don't have insurance. They may be hauling Russian oil or diesel over the price cap, so there's no insurance for them. And so you're starting to see that crackdown. And the U.S. started it with Venezuela, and we've seen it kind of expanding ever since. China's been really fascinating to watch. I'll give you one that most people aren't aware of. So China got kicked out of the 2 terminals in the Panama Canal. There was that big issue at the very beginning of the Trump administration about C.K. Hutchinson selling those terminals. Well, Panama basically took over those terminals, and they have Maersk lines operating now. Well, China is targeting Panama for doing that, specifically Panama flag vessels, which is the second largest registry in the world. When Panamanian ships are coming into Chinese ports right now, they are undergoing extensive inspections. Countries have a right to inspect ships of other registries when they come in. And what Chinese inspectors are doing are dinging those Panamanian ships, forcing those ships to pay for a lot of repairs, and they're delaying them. They're basically costing Panama money. And what we're seeing is ships fleeing from the Panamanian registry over other registries. And it's a little bit of a soft power move by the Chinese against Panama, trying to tell them, listen, don't play games. We own those terminals. Those are our terminals. You can't quite give them away. So I think what we're seeing is how politics and geopolitics can be used economically. We saw it with Trump with the tariffs, for example. This is one of the reasons I think that President Trump had a hard time getting other countries involved in the Strait of Hormuz, because you can't sit there and as president of the United States say, hey, we need help protecting the trade coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, when one of the first things you did as president was initiate a trade war. And so it's a difficult argument to make.
No, it is. I've always been curious about the clandestine operations of China and how they're looking to capitalize on this. And I think one way that they have been is just on Sunday, we saw those patrols around Taiwan, which aren't necessarily directly related to what's happening with Iran. But I certainly think China benefits from attention being everywhere else but on them, and the spotlight not on the South China Sea. So any thoughts on that? Is it intertwined? And if so, what does that do for shipping through the cross trade?
I think it's all intertwined, because the Chinese are always looking for, protection of their trade routes. And so South China Sea is absolutely crucial. They are looking at that all the time. I mean, it is an artery. One of the things I use as an analogy when I try to talk about shipping is I throw maps up of the global shipping, and I say, this is like the circulatory system of the body. And when you close the Strait of Hormuz, that's like clamping a femoral artery in your leg. Well, for the Chinese, the South China Sea is the jugular. I mean, it really is. I mean, there's so much trade that moves through that area, and they are absolutely keen in ensuring that they're able to do it. And one of the things they do is they build redundancy in alternative routes. It's one of the reasons they go into the South Pacific, into the Solomon Islands, and other routes. It's one of the reasons they're developing into the Arctic routes. And, looking at Indonesia, not just through Malacca, but Sunda and Lombok Strait and the Bali Strait. Same thing around the Philippines. So, they're looking to go out into the East Coast of the Philippines if they have to, not just through the South China Sea. So, I mean, China's always looking at this. It's one of the reasons why when they lost the Iranian oil, everybody assumed that, well, this is going to affect China more than everybody else. Well, Iran was buying Iranian oil because it was cheap, but now they can go to other places and buy oil from other people and outbid them. And what we see is Iran's very quick, able to kind of move. So I do believe, watching them, how they play, they are masters of understanding both hard power and soft power when it comes to the maritime dimension. One of the problems I would argue the U.S. has is, if you talk about sea power in the United States, it's the Navy, and that's the only thing they understand. China understands commercial and Navy, and one of the things they do is they understand how to use both of those very effectively. A report just came out that China is building, they have the order book this year, or excuse me, last year, 2025, for 70.9% of all global shipping. I mean, so 70.9% of all ships on order in 2025 was placed in Chinese yards. And so they are really working extremely hard to corner that area of shipping, not just in ship construction, but ship operation, port management, containers, cranes, you name it. They're looking at, having their hands in everything. I always make the analogy is they're kind of like the British East India Company of the modern day in their reach.
Interesting. I'm just reading here that the US is striking Iran right now. That's according to Jonathan Karl of ABC News. He said he was on the phone with Trump as SETCOM announced US retaliatory strikes against Iran. I think it's very important to respond, as Trump speaking, not me. They shot down a helicopter. We are responding as we speak. He added, this is a response to what they did with our helicopter last night, and I believe the response should be very strong, very powerful, and that's what it is. So, I deliver my Trump impressions with a slight tongue-in-cheek. But okay, interesting, Sal. So I guess I saw someone in our stream comments mention that China used to control the seas and then sort of gave it up. But on that point, do you think that ultimately this weakens America's position as guarantor of global trade, unless they're willing to, shadow every single vessel, escort every vessel through the strait?
I think because one of the things I feared was the U.S. was talking about it, was walking away. It's like, listen, not our strait, you kept hearing that quite a bit. Hey, we don't get anything from this strait. This is the world's problem, not our own. And first of all, that's not true. I mean, we do. We were getting 250,000 barrels of oil a year from the Persian Gulf, so it's quite substantial. I do fear that if they walk away, is this the United States, akin to the British East of Suez movement, where they walk away hands off and open it up. And, you do create that potential problem, because I would argue that the U.S., along with its allies, created the environment whereby free trade can move. It's not just the U.S., it was the British, it was the French, it was the Japanese, it's Koreans. So all these countries really established this concept of being able to move around. If all of a sudden you've got to spend more money on navies to protect trade, there's more potential of interdiction, that's going to make things more expensive to move around the world's oceans. And that's kind of what we're seeing now. When you can't go get oil from, Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, and you've got to send your ship now to Houston, Texas. Well, you can get 2 million barrels of oil out of Houston, Texas. The problem is if you're going to Korea, Japan, or Shanghai, that 22-day voyage is now a 55-day voyage. And when you add the round trip into it, you're only getting, one load out of, what normally you can get 2 to 3 loads out of from the Middle East. So we're going to need more ships. You're going to need more cargo. You're going to need more. And every time we kind of readjust this supply chain, we create new kind of breaking points, new choke points around the world. So the Mozambique Channel, the east and west coast of South Africa, all of a sudden become much more important, along with South Africa, in the movement of goods. Small islands across the Indian Ocean become really important. Indonesia becomes absolutely crucial. I mean, we're starting to see that, and you're seeing that with the development of new container terminals in West Africa, on the west coast of South America. We're just definitely seeing that impact felt.
But what does this do for overall, you may have touched upon it, so not for it to be repetitive, but what does this do for the overall maritime security? Because I think what a lot of people don't appreciate, twofold for someone who's worked in the UN, the Law of the Sea Charter is an incredible document, and something that really only an entity like the United Nations could have helped ensure existed. But second, there's been such a lack of, I think, understanding that maritime shipping is, first and foremost, the US is the only global power that is capable of exerting such influence in such a way. And it makes me think of, is it 2011, 2010, when the Somalian pirates crisis was happening around the Gulf of Aden, and the US led that multinational force to deal with it, and it was pretty effective. But it seems to be that the US doesn't have the capacity to do it, or the reluctance to do so from Trump. Where does this leave us?
It does create this huge question, because Somali pirates were an isolated threat, a very small threat in some ways, and this is much larger in many ways. And UN Convention on Law of the Sea, let's not forget, the US is one of the few countries on the planet who have not signed it, ratified it, I should say. Iran is another one. And so it's very hard for US standing to sit there and say, listen, we support this, when we can't get it ratified ourselves. Add to it, the U.S. is conducting operations off the coast of Venezuela against drug boats that raise questions about, is this legal in some way? Excuse me. Excuse me. And so we wind up really having these questions about it. Is this the way we should be moving forward on it? And, you have the British and the French now with a fleet arriving off the coast of the Persian Gulf. The problem is they've announced, listen, we're not going to go in on a mine-sweeping countermeasures until we know for sure the war is over. And that is very open-ended. Don't know when that's going to happen.
But does this mean, how do allies feel? How do allies or adversaries, as we've touched upon, be them in Europe or Asia, when Washington is really struggling to reopen or just get a hold of the situation, regardless of whether they end the blockade or loosen it or whatever? If Trump is not capable of galvanizing a multinational task force, is it just a case of free-for-all now across the globe after this war wraps up or winds down or whatever?
Well, you had that moment where President Trump was telling the world, listen, this is important for you. You need to come and do this. And as I said, I think that was a hard sell at that moment because of the trade conflict. But in truth, it is true. It's like, okay, this is really crucial for everyone. Do you want to hand control of the strait over to Iran? Because Iran hasn't been nice to everybody. And do you want any country to exert that type of influence and control over the passage of 20% of global oil, for example? And I think that's starting to wake up a little bit. But the problem is that for most nations, they are not able to conduct this type of operation. This is a very difficult operation. Logistically, the U.S. is doing everything it can to maintain the presence it has. I did a whole video where I talked about the logistics and keeping 2 aircraft carriers, an amphibious group operating, especially when they lost almost all their bases in the Middle East because they had to vacate them. And they're operating thousands of miles from any sort of really fixed base. This creates a problem. It puts Iran, as you mentioned earlier, in a very interesting position. It gives them the nuclear bomb maybe they didn't have in the case that they're controlling the strait now.
So I appreciate we're getting short on time, but just a couple more questions looking further forward. Simply, Sal, what is going to happen to the Strait of Hormuz then? Does it become a case where it is administered as a toll with a collective sharing between Oman and Iran with the sort of green light of the Gulf states? Is it just Iran forces its preferred conditions on all the others? What do you see as the most likely outcome?
I think we're reaching a point of criticality with the Gulf states. I mean, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, they need this open up. They've got stockpiles of supplies for a shutdown, but those are finite. They're moving goods overland, but even that route is a very difficult one. I think there's going to be a push. I mean, UAE, if you're the UAE, you want Dubai and Abu Dhabi open for public business. You really don't want drones flying into your skyscrapers. It's not good. And so I think there's going to be a very big push from the Gulf states to force some sort of resolution here. I think at the same time, one of the other issues we have is the long-term impacts are going to start hitting now. Oil, I would argue, is one of the easiest commodities to make differences up on because we can get it from different places. You can adjust your consumption. You can move. Plus, we had a lot of oil pre-positioned afloat and ashore to do it. But commodities like helium and commodities like fertilizer are going to start taking root. And we're going to start seeing that. We're seeing increase in fertilizer prices in the United States. We're seeing cut down in production of chips because of lack of helium. That's going to start forcing the hand of everyone. What everybody is seeing now in their gas prices and fuel prices and petrol is this shock. It really, in some cases, is not the actual, lack of commodity out there. I don't think you see long gas lines in the United States and Great Britain and Europe, and even in most East Asia countries. You will see it in some countries around the world because they can't afford it. And you will see expanded prices. But I think this is a shock because one of the things I don't think we appreciate enough is if tomorrow Bibi Netanyahu, President Trump, and the Ayatollah, kiss and make up, and all of a sudden the Strait of Hormuz is wide open, if I'm a shipping company, am I going to send my ships back through there with the same 3 people still in charge? Because this can start again tomorrow. This is going to cause a permanent, I argue, change in how much goods are coming in. And if my ships are going in, you're going to pay me a lot extra to go in there. It's going to cost you more money for me to go in there because war risk is going to go up. I'm going to have to ensure that I'm not going to lose these ships and crews. We're having a hard time getting crews on ships right now because nobody wants to go and relieve a crew in the Persian Gulf and sit out there for good reasons. So, I don't think we realize the long-term impact this having, and it's going to reach a point of criticality. My fear is that President Trump is trying to play a game of chicken with the Iranians. Which economy breaks first? I think what we've seen from the Russia-Ukraine war is it's really hard to break economies. It takes a long, protracted time to do that, especially when there's resources backing them up behind them. And, Iran is getting support. They're getting support from the back door, from the Caspian Sea, from over the border. And Iran is a very tough country to get popular support against the regime. The rest of the world is a different matter.
Yeah, and I guess that's my final question really is simply, are we entering an era now where major shipping lanes, require this political permission rather than international law. You know, the whole idea of Bretton Woods, globalization, shipping is the embodiment of that for many people. We think of the reduction of barriers to trade and an ease of flow of goods and an integration of the global economy. Are we just seeing a reversible of that because of what's happening? Or how do you look at, when you look at shipping, what is the one thing you're taking away so much as the overriding theme?
I think one of the things we're seeing in shipping right now is because shipping is built on ancient precedents. I mean, we have precedents that go back to the ancient Phoenicians. At the same time, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is a 190-page treaty. The U.S. Code of Federal Regulations is 194,000 pages. So it's not like it's, you know, a very long, articulate thing that covers everything. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to shipping. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is nations and forces and groups are you know, using the advantages that are out there, the gray areas to manipulate this. The creation of the shadow fleet is a perfect one. One of the things that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says is like, well, you have to be registered in a state, or else you can be boarded by a navy. But it doesn't really say what happens when that navy boards you. It's like, okay, I proved you're not in a nation state. What's the next step? And so the problem you have obviously is international law, because once you're 12 miles out, it's the wild, wild west. You're in international law waters at that point. And now we're seeing how those areas can be basically used. Iran's making the argument, listen, part of the Strait of Hormuz is within my 12 nautical miles. And therefore, I should be right to exert control over those areas. Now, it overlaps with other countries, Oman, the UAE. And so it creates this kind of ambiguity. And we see that with the issue in the South China Sea with the Chinese and the Philippines, for example. We're seeing this now with the Russians pushing ships through the Arctic. And, I think what we're going to see is more and more issues on it. It's the only way I can explain why a channel about global shipping has the attention it has. It's not because they like tuning into my face. It's because shipping has taken a forefront here over the past couple of years.
Well, I think you're doing yourself a disservice there, Sal, but certainly I guess we could summarize this conversation and the impact of the Iran war as it's muddied the waters a little bit. Okay. Anyway, guys, I'm here all week. Stand up. My new stand-up channel is coming very soon. Don't worry. But no, it's been an absolute pleasure, Sal. I forgot how good it was to speak with you. So we'll have to do it again very soon. I think there's a lot more I'd love to ask you about China, the cross strait, and Southeast Asia as well. But everyone watching, do of course check out what's going on with shipping if you haven't already. Really good stuff that Sal puts out there. And if you haven't already and you're enjoying conversations like this, then of course subscribe and like the video. It's free but easy to do. And we'll see you all very soon. Take care.